All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking the sponsors of today's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors of the month of Elul, Eden Faith Wolf, and family for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of beloved father, grandfather, great-grandfather Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch, Zichron Livracha. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Alan Wiseman, in memory of his beloved wife, Frida Ruth, Rivka Rachel Bas Zechariah, Zichron Livracha, and Baruch Fischel and Sonia Kozlovsky on the birth of their grandson, Aryeh Leib ben Yosef Mordechai, beautiful, to Penina and Yohi Shacht. We hope that Emir Hashem, this little boy, grows up l'Torah, l'chuppah, l'maisim tovim. All of the neshamas should have an aliyah, the families a nechama, and of course we thank our sponsors so much for their sponsorship. And Rabbi, with that, let us begin. So today's daf, Emir Hashem, is Chevron Zoom. You hear me okay? Excellent, thank you. Okay, so today's daf is Lamid Vav. Emir Hashem, beautiful daf ahead of us today. You know, in these days of slichas, mamish, every minute counts when it comes to the daf. So let's begin. So we're picking up Lamed Hamid Beis 35b, and we are picking up Verami Da'oraisa ad Da'oraisa, which is on 35b, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. Supposed to remember again, we left off with the interesting discussion. The Gemara was discussing that Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that Tchumen are Da'oraisa, and interestingly enough, that's why Rabbi Meir ultimately again was Machmir when it came to Tchumen. So it says the Gemara, Rami Daraisa, Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, but let's analyze this. So now you tell me that Rabbi Meir holds that in every case of Safek, we're going to be Machmir, which I will say again is not novel, that in every case of Safek Daraisa, we are going to be Machmir. The Gemara is going to bring up, but is that true? Is that true in all circumstances? After all, says the Gemara, this nan naga what's the interesting case? Let's say over the course of the night you touch someone, but you're not. Here's what I know: a person wakes up in the morning and they know that the person that they're sleeping next to is no longer alive, or a person who was in proximity is no longer alive. Person knows. I know that over the course of the night I touched that person. What's the shaila? The shaila is, was the person alive or already deceased at the time that you touched them? So the Gemara says, Naga be'echa b'layla, touched someone over the course of the night, and I don't know if at the time that I touched them, were they alive or were they dead. I know now, come morning, when I wake up that they are dead. Were they alive or dead over the course of the night? Rabbi Meir says you're tar, the Chum say that you're tameh. We'll say, interestingly enough, why does Rabbi Meir say that you're tahar? So Rashi points out over here, Rashi says, Rabbi Meir metar, da amar ukme achazake, the esmol chayhaya, alma besveka daraisa, vika chazaka lekula, az Rabbi Meir bas chazaka. So also listen to this. So why does Rabbi Meir say that you're tahar? Because Rabbi Meir says, listen, the guy who's dead now had a cheskas chay. Every person has a chazaka that they're alive. So therefore, again, the chazaka is intact until I know to the contrary. The only time I know that he's dead is in the morning. So therefore, lemais, again, the chazaka is that he was alive the entire night, and that when I touched the person, he was alive. He was alive. So you see over there, I will say that in a case, now remember, this is a Safek Daraisa. But even in a Safek Daraisa, where there is a chazaka lekula, there's a chazaka that tells you the presumed state, which translates into a leniency. Rabbi Meir accepts that. Now I will say, now if that's the case, presumably you would say the same thing over here. Remember going back to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah spoke about a case where you made the Eruv with Truma. The Truma became Tameh, but you don't know. Did the Truma become Tameh before Ben Hashmashas, after Ben Hashmashas? And yet Rabbi Meir rules stringently in that case. But yet, again, based on what we just said over here, Rabbi Meir should rule leniently, because Rabbi Meir holds that whenever you have a Safek Daraisa, but you have a Chazaka L'Kula, B'Pashtus you would rely on the Chazaka. To which the Gemara says, the Chum say that you're Tameh. Why? Shekala Tameos Kishas Mitzyaser. I'll say, so the Chum say differently. Chacham say, look, when it comes to a Safek in Tumah, the truth is the only thing you can do is rule on things as they present themselves now. So the guy is dead now. You have to assume that Lamaisa, that status goes back. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, what's the case? The case where the Truma became Tameh is the case we know that there was a sheretz on the Truma the entire time of Ben Hashmashas. 1 second. Bahal Lema Rabbi Yossi Safek Erev Kasher. Both say if there was a sheretz on right? A creepy crawly thing, right? A rodent, on top of the truma, the entire bin hashmashas. Then Rabbi say what? Obviously, then what? The truma's tmeya. The truma's tmeya. Why would Rabbi Yossi say that you have a proper eruv? To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Rabbi Yossi Acha b'shtei kidei edim askin. Rabbi says is very interesting. What's the case here? The case is where halacha l'maisa there are two opposing sets of witnesses. Achas u'meres me'o yom nitmes va'achas u'meres me'shecha shecha. So this is fascinating. So one group of witnesses says that lamaisa, that the truma became tamei from after ben hashmashas, and one says before ben hashmashas. So we'll say what's unfolding over here. Take a look at the last Rashi and the daf. Achas u'meres me'o od yom u'b'hapligi Rabbi Yossi savar uki trei lebahadi trei v'uki truma achazoka kamaisa. So we'll say listen to this. Rabbi Yossi says, look, when you have two opposing sets of witnesses, pretty much what ends up happening is what? They cancel each other out. Now, once the witnesses cancel each other out, what are you left with? You're left with the previous chazaka of the truma. We'll say, what's the previous chazaka of the truma? That's what? That is star. That is star. So remember again, two groups of witnesses cancel each other out. I'm just left with the chazak of the truma that it was tahora. V'chi ancha tahora havi. So we'll say that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, holds kevan diika kat demafkole mechazake besveika daraisa lazlina basra chazaka. So we'll say, listen to this. But Rabbi Meir will say on the following. Rabbi Meir will say, essentially, since you have a group of witnesses who say that halacha l'maisa, the truma was tamei already ben hashmashas, that group of witnesses, as much as there's an opposing group of witnesses, fundamentally erodes the chazaka. Since it fundamentally erodes the chazaka, therefore you have no choice but to declare this a safek daraisa. And once it's a safek daraisa, it's l'chumra. So we'll say this is really actually quite fascinating, because the machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi is really hinged on how do you view two sets of witnesses who say the exact opposite things. So according to Rabbi Yossi, what he will say is they cancel each other out. Just go back to the last known chazaka. What was the last known chazaka of the truma? Last known chazaka? It was tar, because it was tar. Therefore the eruv is good. Conversely, Rabbi Meir holds no. Once you have a group of witnesses who say that the truma was tahora, that erodes the chazaka. That erodes the chazaka. I now have a safek d'oraisa. Safek d'oraisa is l'chumra, and therefore the eruv will not be good. Rashi just points out over here. But in the case of when you touch the person and it turned out that they were dead in the morning, so what there's so aval benogea be'echad, Rashi says, balayla de'in kat motzi asa mechaskaso mukminula kalei bechaskas. Well, it says different than the case of where you touch the person over the course of the night and in the morning they're dead. In that case, because there are no witnesses to erode the chazaka remains. The chazaka is that a person is alive. And therefore, halacha l'maisra, Meir will say that in that case you'll be tar. Really quite interesting. Top of Lamed Vav, Rabbi say. Top of Lamed. Rava Amar Hasam Trei Chazki Lekula V'Hacha Chada Chazaka Lekula. So we'll say Rava says there's another issue. The reason we can distinguish between Rabbi Meir in the two cases is as follows. See, Rabbi say at the end of the day, in the case of where I touched someone over the course of the night and in the morning they're dead, so the Gemara says in that case there's only one chazaka. What's the one chazaka? I'm sorry, in that case there are two chazakas. Right? We'll say, what are the two chazakas? Number one, I have a cheskes tara. Number two, the person who was dead has a chazaka that he was alive. So there are two chazakas that point in that direction. Therefore, Rabbi Meir says, if I'm not sure if the person was alive or dead at the time that I touched them, we can rely on the two chazakas that I am tahar. Conversely, hacha chad the chazaka lekula. In the case of the truma, Rabbi said there's only one chazaka, ultimately again that the truma was tahora. Good. So kasha Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, but again, based on all of this, we have a stira, a machlokis in Rabbi Yossi shitas. Amarafuna bar Chinena shiny tuma hol v'yeshla ikra min Torah. So Rabbi Yossi is going to be machmir. Ultimately, in the case of tumah, remember again, Rabbi Yossi holds that in the case of where I touch someone over the course of the night, in the morning they're dead. I don't know again were they dead at the time of contact or not. Rabbi Yossi says you have to be machmir and the person is tamei. That's because Tuma is the Oraisa. Rabbi Yossi, however, will be Mekel in the case of Truma, used for an Eruv. I don't know, did it become Tameh before Ben Hashmashas, after Ben Hashmashas? Rabbi Yossi will be Mekel. Why? Because that's, Rabbi Yossi will be Mekel. So the Gemara says, so he'll be Machmir by Tuma. Why? V'yesh le'ikra min Torah. Because ultimately Tuma is Midoraisa. I Shabbos nami daraisihi. But one second, Shabbos, or more specifically, Tchumen is also daraisa. Kasar Rabbi Yossi Tchumen dirabanan. Oh, so Rabbi Yossi holds that the whole din of Tchum is midrabanan. So he says just another interesting machlokes Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Meir. And this Rabbi Meir clearly holds that, or Gemara suggests Rabbi Meir holds that Tchumen are daraisa, versus Rabbi Yossi who holds that Tchumen are dirabanan. Okay, very interesting. So the Gemara says as follows: the other possibilities, Hadidei Hadrabe. The Rabbi Yossi, in fact, is espousing two different opinions. One is his opinion, one is the opinion of his Rebbe. So the Gemara says, Deike Nami Diktani. We could also explain this. Rabbi Yossi av tulmus hayed mishum chamisha zakinim shesafek erev kasher shmamina. So also you have Rabbi Yossi saying that av tulmus said over in the name of 5 elders, that ultimately Safek Erev is kasher. So it could be that Rabbi Yossi himself is really more machmir, as we see in the case of Tumah, but Lamaisa, by the case of Erev, he's going ahead and espousing the position of his teachers. Rava Amarava says, Hassam Hainu Tamid Rabbi Meir. So Rava said there, Rabbi Meir's logic is as follows. Hamid Tami al Cheskaso. So now we're going back to the Brayse. Remember again, we had the case in yesterday's daf where the Gemara spoke about a person went to the mikvah, a person was tamei, and they went to the mikvah, or they're not sure if they immersed, if they didn't immerse, or if they did immerse, was the mikvah kasher or not, or there were 2 mikvahs, one was kasher, one was not, they're not sure which one they went into. So we'll say, so why is it that Rabbi Yossi ultimately again is machmir? Because it could be by those cases, Rabbi Yossi will hold, Rabbi Yossi will say, establish a person on their first chazakah. What was the first chazakah? Rabbi will say the first chazakah was that a person was tamei. Or again, we'll say Rabbi Yossi has a very simple cheshbon. When in doubt, you go back to your chazakah. When in doubt, you go back. So again, if we're not sure, did you immerse, did you not immerse? Go to the right mikvah, not go to the right mikvah. So just establish a person based on their previously known chazakah. The previously known chazakah was tamei, it was tumah, to which the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Adraba, hamid mikvah al cheskasava emolo chaser mikvah ve'emolo chaser. I can say just the opposite. Why not go ahead and reestablish the mikvah on its previous status? So we'll say we know that we're assuming over here the mikvah was kasher. So again, why not go ahead and say the chazak of the mikvah was that it's kasher, and therefore Allah Chalamaysa the tefillah should be good. To which the Gemara says, "B'mikvah shelo nimdad." We're talking about a mikvah that in fact was never measured. It was never measured. So because it was never measured, therefore Allah Chalamaysa doesn't even have a chazakah. Tanya, Keitzad, Rabbi Yossi, Safek, Erev Kasher. So just again, we're going to continue with this, but just pointing out that there's so many things happening over here. So I just want to point out there's a machlokes about Tchumen D'oraisa D'Rabanan, which is really quite fascinating. Another machlokes, but I'll say ultimately again, how do you deal with chazakas? Right? How do you deal with chazakas? When do you utilize chazakas? What happens when you have a case of 2 eidim versus 2 eidim? How does that impact the chazakah? So there's a lot of incredible things that are happening, swirling around this machlokes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir. So says the Gemara Tanya, Keitzad Rabbi Yossi Safek Erev Kasher. What's the case? What's the case according to Rabbi Yossi, where we will say Safek Erev Kasher? Right? They will say, what is that case? Where a Safek Erev will be kasher. So here we go. The Gemara says, Erev bitruma. If a person went ahead and made an Erev with truma, Safek mi ba'od yom nitmes, Safek mi chashecha nitmes. So we'll say, here's the case. I made an Erev with truma, and again, as we have established already, even if I'm not a Kohen, I can make an Erev with truma, because remember, again, as long as my Erev is edible by someone, edible and accessible by someone, the Erev is kasher. So I made an Erev with truma, right? There's only one issue, which is the truma became tmeya. The question is, did it become tamei before Ben Hashmashas, in which case the Erev is not good, or after Ben Hashmashas, in which case the Erev is good? So the Gemara says, V'chein Peiros. Similarly, again, if I made an Erev with fruit, Safek mi ba'od yom niskenu, Safek mi chashecha niskenu, and I will say, what happened? I'm not sure. Ultimately, again, now we're gonna reframe this in just a moment. But it sounds like what it's saying over here is, I'm not sure if they were tithed before Ben Hashmashas or after Ben Hashmashas. Ultimately, again, Eruv kasher. So the Gemara says in all of these cases the Erev is kasher. So we'll say these are the cases. This is according to the Braysa. These are the cases, according to Rabbi Yossi, of Safek Eruv, which will be kosher. So again, I have Truma, not sure did it become Tameh before Ben Hashmashas, after Ben Hashmashas, Eruv is kosher. I have Eruv with fruit, not sure were they properly tithed before Ben Hashmashas, after Ben Hashmashas, the Eruv is kosher. Aval, Eruv b'Truma, Safek Darav, Safek Tmeya. Rabbi will say, if I used Truma, and I will say to begin with, I'm not sure if the Eruv was Tahora or Tamir. And I will say, and remember again, this is different than the first case. In the first case, I know that the Truma was Tahor. What's the suffix? When did it become Tameh? In case number 2, the Truma being used, there was a suffix from the beginning whether or not this Truma was ever Tahora. Aval ire b'Truma suffix Torah suffix Tmeya. But I will say, if I go ahead and I utilize Truma, and I was just never sure whether or not there was Tamir or Tahor, v'chim beperis, suffix niskanu, suffix lo niskanu. So too, again, I will say, if I have fruit, and again, I never know their status, ein ze suffix eruv kosher. Ultimately, again, this will not be a proper eruv. This is not the case of suffix eruv kosher. So the Gemara says, I don't understand what's going on over here. Ma'ishna truma damer hemet truma achas kasa ve'ema tahorihi peris nami hemet tevel achas kasa ve'ema lo niskino. So we'll say, I don't understand. Just like Rabbi Yossi is saying, obviously, when Rabbi Yossi says that suffix truma, so we'll say in this case over here, I use truma for case number 1. I use truma for the eruv. I'm not sure, did it become tamei before Ben Hashmashos, after Ben Hashmashos? Rabbi Yossi paskins that it's a kasher eruv. What's the logic behind that? Hemet truma achas kasa. Establish Truma on its chazaka. What's the chazaka of Truma? The chazaka of Truma is that it's tar. So therefore, I assume. So why don't I say the same thing? That in the case of fruit, I'm not sure if they were tithed, not tithed. Go ahead and establish the fruit based on their chazaka. What's the chazaka of fruit, Rabbi say? That they are untithed. To which the Gemara says, Lo tema safik miba odyom niskenu ela ema safik miba odyom nidmu'u. Safik mechashecha nidmu. What's the case I will say? The case over here is halacha l'maisa, not niskinu but nidmu. Nidmu means I will say that the fruit got mixed in with other untithed produce. So the fruit in question that I originally used for the eruv was definitely tithed. What ended up happening was that fruit got mixed in with other fruit that was tevel. Now the problem is the mixture is not really edible, and the shaila is, did the mixture occur before Ben Hashmashas or after Ben Hashmashas? So we'll say, what you begin to see, I just want to point out, the reason why this price is very important is because according to Rabbi Yossi, what you begin to see is that his cases of suffix, I will say, require me to know that the item in question at some point in time were absolutely fit for use. So for example, I have Truma that was 100% fit for use. It becomes tamei. My only shaila was when it became tamei. But let's say if you were to use truma, and from the beginning, from the moment you took it for the eruv, you weren't sure about its status, according to Rabbi Yossi, that would not work. Just want to point out that interesting distinction, and it makes sense because Rabbi Yossi's lenient ruling in case of suffix has to do with establishing something based on its last known chazaka. So in a case where the truma was tahar, then became tameh, I just don't know when it became tameh. I could fall back on the last known chazaka. But if from the beginning the truma never had a definitive status, so from the time that I utilized it for eruv, I already wasn't sure what its status was. You can't say I established it back on its previous held chazaka. Very fascinating. Bar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak ben Rav Huna. Interesting case. If a person had in front of him 2 loaves, achos tameh achos tahora, so we'll say, let's say 2 loaves of truma. One was tameh, one was tar. What's the problem? He doesn't know which one is which. So I have 2 loaves. Here's what I do know. I know for sure that one is tahar, and I know for sure that one is tameh. I just don't know which is which. And I have a great idea. Va'amar irvuli b'tahora b'chol makom shi. I will say, I make the following formulation. I hereby designate the tahar loaf to be my eruv. Okay, so we'll say, what do I know? I know that one of them is tahar. What don't I know? Which one it is. So does such a formulation work? So Mao, Tibai Rabbi Meir, Tibai Rabbi Yossi. It's a Shiloh according both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. How so? Tibayil Rabbi Meir and Kanlo Kam Rabbi Meir Hasam Deleka Tahora. So Rabbi Meir was only machmir in the case beforehand because there was no tar loaf. Hacha Ika Tahora. But at the end of the day, there is a one tar edible loaf out of these two. O Dilma. Afil Rabbi Yossi lo Kamar Ella Hasam Dim Isadi Tahora Yadala. Or even again previously, Rabbi Yossi is Mekel. Why? Because in the previous cases, again, if it is tar, you could identify it. Aval Hacha. Here Abba say the tar loaf is unidentifiable. Amarle, to which ultimately again he responded to him. Remember again, this is Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak asking Rav Huna. So Rav Huna responded, Amarle, Bim Rabbi Yossi ben Rav Meir Ba'inon Suuda Haruya Mi Ba'odyon Valeka. So we'll say here the Gemara introduces a new principle, which actually is going to be, I think, either tomorrow or the next day's daf, which is the concept of Suda Haruya Mi Ba'odyon. Which means that in order for your Eruv to be effective, you must have a meal which is edible by day. So as Rabbi say that halacha, we'll see where this concept comes from exactly, but the idea over here being is that the Eruv must be made from something that was 100% edible on Erev Shabbos. Rabbi say the problem, of course, in this case is this meal, quote unquote, is not edible. Why? Because even on Erev Shabbos, what don't you know? Which is the tahar loaf. So because nothing here was really edible already as of Erev Shabbos, therefore the Eruv does not work. And that seems to be L'divrei HaKol according to all opinions. So the Gemara goes weiter. So Rav asks another kasha of Rav Nachman. Says the Gemara, Kikarzu hayom chol ulamachar kodesh. This is very interesting. Vamar erevuli bazeh mahu. So let's listen to this. If a person makes a stipulation and he says as follows, this loaf, today, we'll say, now remember, he's making this declaration on Friday. So today, it shall be chol. Today, Friday, Erev Shabbos, it shall be, right, mundane. But if I hereby consecrated comes Shabbos. All right, and I will say what happens. And then he uses this very loaf to create his Eruv. Mahu, what is the status of the Eruv? Amrale, Eruva Eruv. He said, Allah, again, the Eruv works. It works. Hayom Kodesh Ulam Machar Chol. But see what happens if a person says, today my Eruv should be Kodesh, and today, meaning Erev Shabbos, the loaf should be consecrated. But come Shabbos, it should become unconsecrated. So the Gemara says, Amrle Eruvli Bazeh. And Allah said, then let this loaf be my Eruv. Mahu Amrle Ein Eruva Eruv. He said, in that case, it does not work. The Eruv does not work. So my Shna. So I don't see the difference in the two cases. So in case number one, where I say, let my Eruv be Chol today and Kodesh tomorrow, the Eruv works. But then if I say, let my Eruv be Kodesh today and Chol tomorrow, the Eruv does not work. So I don't understand. Amrlei, so he said to him, I will say, so again, this is Rava asking Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman responded back, you know what, if you give me a core of salt, I'll answer your question. So I'll say, so this was a joke. This was Talmudic humor. You know, give me, what are you going to give me? What are you going to give me? And I'll answer your question. So he says, here's the distinction. Hayom chol ulamachar kodesh, misveika lo nachse kedusha. So we'll say, you have to understand, what's the issue at hand? See, interestingly enough, Eruv takes effect when? Ben Hashmashas. Ben Hashmashas is a time that is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. You made a declaration that changes the status of the item from one day to the next. So the shaila is, what happens ben hashmashas? So Rav Nachman essentially responds, he says, look, misveika, hayom chol machar kodesh, misveika lo nachsa kedusha. So I'll say, when you say hayom chol machar kodesh, alt safek, the kedusha is not going to devolve upon the item. Hayom Kodesh Ulamacha Chol, and when you say today is Kodesh and tomorrow is Chol, Misveka lo paka le Kedusha samine. Out of Safek, the Kedusha doesn't leave it. Or Rabbi say, to say it a little bit differently, Ben Hashmashas cannot affect change in an item. Because Ben Hashmashas itself, let me say it a little bit differently. Whenever you go ahead and you hinge the status of an item on a particular day, that status can't change during Ben Hashmashas. That's essentially what it's saying. Why? Because Ben Hashmashas itself is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. So when you say Hayom Chol Machar Kodesh, so that item retains its Chol status through Ben Hashmashas. Therefore, the Eruv is good. When you see Hayom Kodesh Makar Chol, so the item retains its Kodesh status through Ben Hashmashas, and therefore the item is not good for Eruv. So we'll say, so Rav Nachman is a very simple idea that again, the status of an item doesn't really change. In other words, when you're hinging the status on the day, so ultimately, again, the status will not change during Ben Hashmashas. Ben Hashmashas cannot affect calendrical challenge, Ben Hashmashas cannot affect calendrical change within an item. Tanan Hasam, we learned login tvul yom shemalu min achavis shal meiser tevel. That was a very interesting case. Login is a wooden pitcher. So if you have a wooden pitcher, tvul yom. So remember again, wooden pitcher, which supposedly means it became tameh, the pitcher itself, but it was immersed in the mikvah, but it still required sunset in order to become totally tar. That's tvul yom. So I've login tvul yom shemalu min achavis. And I will say, what did I do? I used that wooden pitcher to, let's say, draw out wine. Minachavis shal meiser tevel. From a barrel of wine that was meiser tevel. I will say, what's meiser tevel? Meiser tevel is when you separate out meiser and give it to the Levi, right? Remember, give truma to the Kohen. I give meiser to the Levi. The Levi is then obligated to go ahead and give trumas meiser. Trumas Meiser. So before the Levi gives Trumas Meiser, so ultimately again, that barrel is called Meiser Tevel. Interesting name, right? So I went ahead and I used the pitcher, that's a Tvul Yom, to draw out wine from a barrel of Meiser Rishon that has not yet had its Trumas Meiser removed, and therefore it's called Meiser Tevel. V'Omer, Hareze Trumas Meiser Lechishatech Shach, and I say let the wine in the pitcher become the Trumas Meiser on the barrel as soon as it gets dark. Dvarav Kayamin. Ultimately, again, the statement works. So the Gemara says, V'im Amar Eruvuli Bazeh. But if I say, let my Eruv be made with this item, Lo Amar Klum. Ultimately, again, such a statement is meaningless. And we'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. So ultimately, Rashi says, V'im Amar Eruvu Belagin Zeh Lo Amar Klum. Hoil V'chimata Ben Hashmosha Sakati Taval Hava. Because we'll say, at the end of the day, the Gemara says that when Ben Hashmashas came, ultimately it was still considered to be tevel, and you can't make an eruv with tevel. So let's remember again, this is going back on the same sugi. Remember, because when are you designating? When are you designating ultimately again the barrel of the contents of the pitcher as trumas meiser l'chishatech when it becomes dark? Dark is a definitive time of day. The change is not being affected until dark. That means the Eruv was not affected. Ben Hashmashas. So the Gemara says, Amarava Rava says, Zo someres sof hayom kona Eruv. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, so remember again, so I want to point out what's happening over here. So you're drawing wine from a barrel that has not had its Trumas Meiser taken from it. You then draw water from it. Draw wine from it. You say the contents of the pitcher should be Trumas Meiser on the barrel, and then let the barrel ultimately again become my Eruv. So the Gemara says it doesn't work. I mean, the Trumas Meiser designation works, but the Eruv doesn't work. Why doesn't the Eruv work? Because Eruv is affected at Ben Hashmashas, and the status of this barrel at Ben Hashmashas was what? Tevel, because the Trumas Meiser designation doesn't take effect until it's nighttime. So the Gemara says, Rava says, Amar Rava Zos Someres, Sof Hayom Kona Eruv. Both say very fascinating. Rava says, what do you see from here? That it is the end of the day. Let's say now, end of the day means beginning of Ben Hashmashas. It's the end of the day, beginning of Ben Hashmashas, that creates the effectiveness of the Eruv. And I will say, since, again, at the beginning of Ben Hashmashas, so the barrel is still tevel, because the Trumas Meiser designation doesn't take place until nightfall. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, the Eruv is not good. Amud Beis, di'i sakadaitcha tchilas hayom kona. Because I will say, if you would hold that ultimately, again, it's the beginning of the night. Now, in this context, remember again, beginning of the night, I will say, means the end of Ben Hashmashas. So if the end of the night, beginning of Ben Hashmashas, if the beginning of the night, end of Ben Hashmashas, would be the time when Eruv is affected, then halacha l'maisa, there would be an overlap of time from the time that Trumas Meiser designation took effect, in which case, again, the barrel could be effective for Eruv. So we'll say this is actually quite fascinating, because what the Gemara is presupposing is that the Eruv need not be effective for the entire Ben Hashmashas. It doesn't have to be effective. The shaila is which part of Ben Hashmashas does it have to be effective for? Is it what we call Sof Yom? Sof Yom means the end of the day, beginning of Bein Hashmashas, or what we call Tchilas Hayom, which means the beginning of the night, the end of Bein Hashmashas. So we'll say, really just quite fascinating. What is the minimum amount of Bein Hashmashas that you need? I will say, by the way, there's a third possibility. What's a third possibility? Third possibility is any part of Bein Hashmashas, right? Any part of Bein Hashmashas. To which the Gemara says, because we'll say, if you would say that ultimately, again, the beginning of the night, end of Bein Hashmashas works, is Kona Erev, by the time you get to the beginning, end of Bein Hashmashas, that is the beginning of the night. Once you get to the night, so then the stipulation of that this should be Trumas Meiser works. If the contents of the pitcher become Trumas Meiser, then Allah Meiser, the pitcher is now effectively tithed. If it's effectively tithed, then the Eruv should work. To which the Gemara says, Papa says, no. Even if you were to hold that the beginning of the night, end of Bein Hashmashas, works to affect the Eruv, this case still won't be good. Why? Because I will say, once again, we come to this concept, so we'll say again, we don't know where this concept comes from, but Lamaisa, again, this is the second time that it is being quoted, which is that in order for an Eruv to be effective, it must be a Su'uda Haru'uya Bayom. It must be something that is fully edible by day. And since in this case, I will say the Eruv is not edible by day. Why isn't it edible by day? Because everyone agrees that in this particular case, what's the status of the barrel by day? It's tevel. Or I should say, it's untied, we'll call it tevel. It's untied Trumas Meiser. So therefore, we'll say, therefore, it won't work. So we'll say a very important yesod that emerges from this, which is we can deal with all kinds of cases of safek. We could deal with that. But one thing is clear, which is the Eruv itself must be in a state of edibility on Erev Shabbos. So if you were to have an Eruv which does not become fit for consumption until sometime later on, or sometime on Shabbos, halacha l'maisa, that Eruv will not work. That Eruv will not work. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say, let's analyze here. Lamed Vav Amud Beis, the Mishnah. Masna Adam Ale Ruva. So we'll say another fascinating case here. Masna Adam Ale Ruva va'omer. We'll say a person can make it tonight. So we'll say, so now remember, we're talking about Eruv Tchumen still. In this case, we're going to say, so let's just talk about this because we never explicitly said this, but it's important now to highlight this yesod. When you make an Eruv, so remember again, what does an Eruv do for you? An Eruv extends your Tchum in one particular direction. Now, in general, without an Eruv, let's say I don't make an Eruv Tchumen. So we'll say, what's my range of mobility? So range of mobility is I could go 2,000 amas in any direction. North, south, east, west. I have 2,000 amas in any direction of my city that I want. Once you make an Eruv Tchumen, and you extend your Eruv by another 2,000 amas in one direction, you by definition lose your mobility in every other direction. So remember again, what you will say, it's a very important yesod, a very important musar in life. Whenever you choose something, you always sacrifice something else. That's why in life you have to make your choices incredibly carefully. You know, we like to think, I want to, eat my cake and have it too? Is that the expression? Right? Eat my cake and have it too. It doesn't work that way in life. It does not work that. Actually, people want to eat their cake and have it too and then have some more afterwards. I'll say, but again, it doesn't work that way in life. Whatever you choose, every choice always comes with a sacrifice. That's the way that it works. So that's why in life you have to make your choices very carefully. The paradigmatic example of that is Eruv. So you want to choose to go further in one direction, that's incredible. That's your journey, that's your mahalach, that's your direction, that's your kivun. Excellent. But understand, if you choose that path, you've given up, you've sacrificed all of the other paths. Now the good news is, you've only sacrificed it for that Shabbos. Right? Because I will say, sometimes in life we choose the wrong path. And it's okay, because although you might be locked into that path for a little bit of time, there's always the ability to go ahead and rechart the course of my life relatively quickly. So Lamais again says the Mishnah over here, Masna Adam Ale Ruvo Va'omer. So we'll say in this case over here, a person wanted to, now again, so in this case, I want to put out a multiple Eruve Tchumen. But of course, I'm only going to use one. But I put out, like, let's say I put out the different directions, and I say as follows, Omer, in Bo Nochra Min HaMizrach, Eruvin Amarav. In Min HaMarav, Eruvin HaMizrach. So also listen to this. So in this case over here, it sounds like the case is, I'm scared of an incoming Gentile army. So I want to make an Eruv. Obviously, so I want to make an Eruv. So I say to myself like this: if the Gentiles come from the east, I want my Eruv to the west to be effective. And if the Gentiles come from the west, I want my Eruv to the east to be effective. So in this case over here, I'm scared of some incoming group of people. I put down 2 Eruv Tchumen, and I just choose after the fact which one I want to use. Bo lekan lekan. What happens if the Nachrim come from the east and the west? Lamakom she'er tze'elech. Then I want the ability to choose whichever Eruv I want to use. Good. So the Gemara says as follows: Lo bo'u lo lekan v'lo lekan. But if it turns out that the Nachrim don't come at all, harini kibnei iri. Then Rabbi said, I don't want either of the Eruv Tchumen to take effect. Why not, Rabbi said? Because remember, in that case, I'd rather just be like the residents of my city. In which case, I can go on 2,000 amas in any direction I choose. Lo ba. So the Gemara says, in ba chacham minaz mizrach. Similarly, again, Rabbi said, let's say there's a visiting scholar in residence. So if the Talmid Chacham is coming from the east and I want to go see him, Eruvi lemizrach, then I want my Eruv to the east to take effect. Mina Ma'ariv, if he comes from the west, Eruvi Ma'ariv, I want to go to the west. Bo lekan lekan. What happens if there are 2 scholars in residence that Shabbos? I don't know who I want to see. Lamakom she'er tze'elech. Then I want to reserve the right to go whichever direction I want. Lo lekan v'lo lekan. No scholar in residence shows up that Shabbos. Harini kibnei iri. Ultimately, again, I would like to be like the residents of my city, and therefore have 2,000 amas in every direction. Huda Omer, im haya echad mehen rabo, holich itz rabo. Huda says that if one of the 2 visiting scholars in residence is your Rebbe, then by definition, you go in the direction of your Rebbe. In other words, your Eruv in the direction of your Rebbe takes effect first. So what's an incredible yisod? Because we assume, although we're going to see this in Machlokes, we assume that a person would rather go to their Rebbe than anyone else. And if both of them are your Rebbeim, then you go in any direction you want. So both say, bepashtos, this Mishnah is predicated on the concept of breira. A breira, which means retroactive clarification. So in this case over here, I'm creating 2 Eruv Tchumens, right? 2 Eruv Tchumens on Erev Shabbos. And I'm putting them in different directions. I don't know which one I want to use, and I want to choose which one I want to use on Shabbos itself. Whichever one I use is activated, the other one is simply nothing. And the Mishnah seems to indicate to me that halacha l'maaseh is absolutely accessible. So let's do another minute. Says the Gemara, Kias Rabbi Yitzchak Tani Ipcha. What's interesting? Rabbi Yitzchak, this is fascinating. Rabbi Yitzchak had an opposite version of this Mishnah. He says, but kulam asnis and kash. So we'll listen to this. So we'll say, in Rabbi Yitzchak's version, he had it like this: that a person sets up an Eruv Tchumen for the Nachrim, and he says, if the Nachrim come from the west, I want my Eruv to the west to take effect. If the Nachrim come from the east, I want to go to the east. So in Rabbi Yitzchak's version, a person wants to go out to meet the Gentiles. Conversely, when he sets up the Eruv for the visiting scholar, for the Chacham, he says, if the scholar comes from the east, I want to go west. And if he comes from the west, I want to go east. So what's the pshat? So let's listen to this. So he says, Kasha Nachrim, Kasha Chacham, Machachamim. Nachrim no Kasha. It's not a contradiction. Ha beparagavna, ha b'mari demasa. Both they're different nachrim. If you're talking about like a marauding army, right? Rashi says paragavni is gaboy hamas uborech b'meim. Actually, it's tax collectors. So it says obviously not to sakanas nefashas, because if it's sakanas nefashas, mortal danger, you don't have to wear erev tchumen. But a tax collector. So what happens when the tax collector comes to town? No one really wants to be there. So what happens? So the Mishnah went to the tax collector. So I say if the tax collector comes from the east, I want my Eruv to the west to take effect. And if the tax collector comes from the west, I want to go from the east. Versus Rabbosai, versus ultimately the Mari Demasa. Mari Demasa Rabbosai is the person in charge of the city. When he comes, I actually want to be able to meet him to speak about any concerns I have. So therefore, again, sometimes when in case of Nachrim, you want to run the other direction. Sometimes you want to run towards, fine. Chacham achacham lo kasha. Similarly, again, I will say the Chacham is also not a contradiction. Ha b'mosif pirki, ha b'mikri shma. One is talking about, we'll say literally again, most of Pirki is talking about like a scholar, someone who gives a shir to the general public. That's the kind of person I would want to go and hear. Versus Mikri Shma, Rashi says over here is Kilomar Melamde Tinokos Lispalel. It's talking about a Rebbe, like a Melami Dardiki. So that type of person, again, I have no particular interest, very important guy, but I have no particular interest in hearing him. So I don't need my Eruv in order to go ahead and go towards him. So the case of the Mishnah where I want to go towards the Rav is talking about someone who's giving shiurim to the public, versus in Rabbi Yitzchak's Mala where I want to go in the other direction is just, again, a very important person, a Rebbe in a yeshiva and is teaching the children, but Lamaisa, I don't need to go hear him on Shabbos. All right, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up at the 2 dots tomorrow. Shkoyach.